Okay, good evening. I'm Chris Meisner from the Department of Economics, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this evening's talk as part of our Levine Family Series. The Levine Family Series, just a quick plug here, was generously endowed by the Levine family to sponsor discussion on issues and topics in current economics, to bring the general public to UC Davis and to have a debate about these issues. So we're very happy this evening to have the second in our series this year. We have two more upcoming talks later in the spring. The next one will be with Emmanuel Saez, the winner of the John Bates Clark Medal, and our very own Professor Emeritus Peter Lindert. They'll be discussing the role of the social welfare state in the globalized economy, and then later in May we'll have Professor of Economics from Harvard, Claudia Golden. So hopefully many of you can come to that. Tonight we're again happy to have Professor Hal Varian join us, currently at Google as the chief economist, formerly dean of the School of Information and Management Systems at Berkeley, and professor of economics in various institutions. His biography is rather long, and there's no need to waste time going through all of this because I think it speaks for itself. I view Varian almost as useful as Google, because we all know Google, we hear about it about 2 times every hour, we use it every minute of the day, and as an economist, from undergraduate all the way to graduate to a practicing economist, we rely on his textbook, and it's part of our lives. And so without further ado, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor Varian. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that nice and succinct introduction. If you do want my biography, just Google it. It's not hard to find. So today I want to talk to you about some work that we've done at Google. And we're calling it Predicting the Present. It was Yogi Berra who said prediction is hard, especially about the future. Although I was corrected in this. It was actually Niels Bohr, is that right? Who said it? Yes?
And it was attributed to various people.
That's right. Well, I think that it's such a good line that many people want to take credit for it. So, people are interested in predicting the future. We decided to lower the bar a little bit and predict the present, but as you'll see, that's still going to be pretty useful. And I should say much of this is joint work with my colleague Hyun-Young Choi. So, let us start out. I've got a question for the audience. Little quiz to begin with. Which day of the week are there the most searches for hangover? All right, which day? So how many people, let's just have a show of hands, how many people say Sunday? And how many people say Monday? How many people say Tuesday? Oh, it's a very sober crowd here. Wednesday? All right, there's a party animal back there in the back row. How do you find out? Well, what you do is you go to this tool that you have at Google called Google Search Insights or Google Trends. And with this tool, you can discover which day of the week has the most searches for hangover. You just type in hangover, and you look at the United States, and we pick the date here, and then we hit search, and we see this very, very regular series, which turns out to peak every Sunday morning. And what is this big spike? That's January 1st, okay? That's January 1st. So you see that there's a very regular pattern in terms of searches for hangover. If you scroll down on this page, you can actually see the hangover capital of the US, which turns out to be New York. So what this is a picture of the relative queries on hangover relative to the total queries from each state. And California is up there as well. Somehow you have this big region in the middle where it's not such a popular query. Over here you can see the top searches, and then here you can see the ones that have been increasing the most. So it's a very nice tool, and you can have endless hours of amusement playing around with it. You can also type in multiple queries and compare the volume of searches on different queries. And here I've done one where I compare the searches on hangover to the searches on vodka. And you can see what's going on. Every Saturday, those searches on vodka peak, and on December 31st, the searches on vodka peak. And you get this very regular relationship between the series. So it might occur to somebody that the searches on vodka would be predictive of the searches on hangover. And indeed, that's the path that we're going to pursue, of trying to look at how you can use this data to predict things. And here's a nice example. This is I put up just for the university crowd. This is the pattern of searches on Civil War in the US. And look how regular it is. What's going on? I want to hear from a professor. This is term papers. Right here. You see where that peak is? That's 2 days before the paper's due. I don't know that for a fact, but pretty much it ends up being very close to the end of term in most places. And then here's the peak for the fall semester, the semester we're in now. So in fact, if you type in any historical term, type in Winston Churchill, World War II, anything like that, you will see this very, very regular pattern that I just showed you, which is in fact due to the searches, I assume, that mostly students are doing to try to get their term papers done in time. So there's lots of fun things that you can do with Google Search Insights. But what we want to do is some serious things. Would like to take some economic data, economic indices of various sorts, take the usual sort of things that you use to predict those series, own lags of the variables, seasonality, the trends, and so on, and then add in Google trend data, the kind of data that I showed you in those previous screens, and see how well you can predict the particular series of interest. And one thing I didn't show you, but I better go back and do that before it's too late, is right up here, there's a little link that says download a CSV file. You can click on that link, pull the data down, and then you can use that to compare to particular series you might be interested in. Okay, so that's the goal of what I'm going to talk about. There's 2 working papers you can find from Google research, predicting the present with Google Trends, predicting initial claims for unemployment benefits, and if you want to follow up on any of this, you can just go download those papers. Okay, so here's the methodology that we recommend, and one could quarrel about some of these points, but it seems to work pretty well. What you want to do is fit the best model you can using the data that you have available. So maybe that's the previous values of the time series. And then you add in the Google Trends data as an additional predictor, and then you want to look at how much you improve the out-of-sample forecast measured by something like the mean absolute error. So that tends to be what we use for our measurement. And one thing that's quite important that all economists are aware of is it's very, very easy to predict series that go like this, and it's very easy to predict series that go like this. The hard thing is the turning points, right? The hard thing in economics is always to find when the economy goes from a boom period into a bust, or from a bust into a boom, and so we're particularly interested in looking at those turning points. Okay, so the basic points: do the best you can with the information you have, and then look at the incremental value, the improvement that you get in your accuracy from adding in the Google Trends data. Couple things you have to worry about here. It's what econometricians call mixed frequency estimation. The data that's available in official economic statistics is usually monthly data, sometimes even quarterly data. The data that comes from Google is real-time data. It comes in on a day-by-day basis. So you'll see daily or weekly data depending on the time period that you look at. And actually, I think this is something that's very important for economics as a whole. Many, many businesses now have real-time data systems. You can get real-time data, day-by-day data from MasterCard of what retail sales look like. You can get daily data from FedEx, from UPS, from Target, from all sorts of companies that'll provide you with very high frequency data. But what we've got to work with at the level of government data is relatively low frequency, monthly or quarterly data. And I think there's a big challenge for economics in trying to integrate that high frequency data with the low frequency data. And to the extent that we're successful in doing that, we should be able to come up with better ways of tracking economic activity. So this is one set of examples of this. Second thing is that Google Trends data that I showed you, it's an index. If you look closely at those charts, the highest point in each graph is labeled 100. So it's not raw data on how many queries there were on Hangover. What it shows is the fraction of queries that are on Hangover out of all queries that are issued in this particular location over this particular time period. So you're looking at query share in this case, okay? And then you're also normalizing it to be 100 just at the maximum point. Third thing is that you have to have at least 50 observations from distinct IP addresses to get into that database. And that's really for privacy reasons, because people might issue very specific queries that would have identifying information in them, so there have to be 50 distinct queries from different IP addresses to show up in the database. And that's actually a little bit of a problem, because when you're focusing at a very small geographic area, then there would be lots of potentially interesting queries where you just don't have the 50. But it's a compromise we have to make. Next point is that this is sampled data. So you're sampling out of a set of all queries, so it has a little bit of variation, a couple % variation from day to day. And finally, the last point, which is quite interesting, is that you can look at data in context, okay? So think about a simple query like Apple. Well, which Apple? Apple the fruit, Apple the computer company, or Apple the music company? There are lots of different contexts that you could search for Apple, and indeed you can tell, or you can, on that form, you can choose to search for a given term in a certain context. So for example, don't go to sleep on me. I think I have a frozen keyboard here. We may have to. We're stuck. Can't seem to get it to move. Have we got an AV person who can look at this? There we go. All right. All right, so to illustrate that last point, the top graph is the search for Apple in the context of food and drink, and you can see it's very, very regular, peaking pretty much every November in apple season. And if you look down, you'd see searches for apple pie, applesauce, apple recipes, all that stuff. Down here is Apple in the context of computers and electronics, and you'll see that it tends to peak before Christmas every year because it's a popular Christmas present, and also it peaks when there are product announcements and so on from Apple. So it's very handy because it helps you to what they call disambiguate the searches that you're interested in doing. All right, and finally the last point is that you can just search for a category itself. So here there's no search term, and over here I picked the category vehicle shopping, and we looked at the United States from 2008 to 2010 for vehicle shopping, and what do you see? This big, big bump here in 2009. That was a Cash for Clunkers program, which was a hugely popular program. All right, so now you've got a little flavor of what Google Search Insights look like. So let me just ask the audience, raise your hand if you've used this tool. Just played around with it. All right, so we got about maybe 30%, 20% of the audience has used it. So let me talk first about using it in the context of forecasting automobile sales. So earlier I said I was interested in predicting the present, and now I'm talking about forecasting, so maybe I should clarify exactly what I mean by that. In general, we're not thinking about trying to predict the distant future, because when you look at these government variables, you'll see the data for April auto sales would be released sometime towards 11 days, usually 11 days into the month. So what you're seeing is a kind of reporting delay in getting a lot of this monthly data reported. Whereas at Google, because we have this real-time data, and you look on a day-by-day basis, maybe halfway through April, you can get a pretty good idea of what the automobile sales look like for that month. You could forecast the sales, and you're really predicting the present. That is, you're using the April data to predict the April sales, but you're ahead of the actual release of that data by about a month. So when I'm talking about predicting the present, in most of these cases, I'm trying to look at the current level of queries, current volume of queries, to predict what's going on at that particular time, but that's still generally a month ahead of when the data is actually released. So that's why we call it predicting the present. So here we look at automobiles, and what we do is we look at US auto sales by make. So the monthly summaries are released with a 1-week lag, and you can get this data from industry sources like Automotive Data Center. And then we've got the Google Trends data is released on a daily or weekly basis, and there are about 27 different automakers that are tracked in that Google Trend data. So if you take the tool that I showed you a few minutes ago, you can pick Ford, Toyota, Chevrolet, plot the series that shows how those sales are evolving over time. Now, if you download that data, then you can plot the actual search volume against the sales data. So here's a little picture where we took Toyota, Ford, Chevrolet, and so on, and just plotted the actual sales of those cars in a given month against the queries, the vehicle shopping queries for those cars. And you don't have to have taken many advanced econometrics courses to recognize that there's a pretty common pattern in terms of the cyclical behavior of those two series. So it's not too surprising that somebody who's thinking about buying a Ford might be going to the Ford website, querying about Ford, looking at reviews of Ford, and so on. So what you can do is you can build a little econometric model, and I'm not going to go into details here. In this particular case, we said the log of sales depends on various things, which includes the Google queries on that particular make during the first 2 weeks of the month. So I mentioned as released with a month lag, when we're looking at April, halfway through April, we've got the Google data on how many searches have taken place on a particular make during those first 2 weeks, and then we're going to use that to forecast what the monthly sales look like when the data is released 3 or 4 weeks later. And if you do that, you end up getting really quite a remarkable fit where you see the sales of Toyota looking, for example, being pretty well predicted by using the previous sales of Toyota. So we want to use that historical data plus this extra information that's in the queries. And you can also look at it on a single model case. So this is what things look like if we look just at Toyota versus the using the estimates using the Google Trends data, ends up looking pretty much like this. And if you see these deviations where you're not predicting very well, what tends to happen is those will be cases where there'd be a dealer promotion or some extra event of that sort. So you can, if you had complete data on what promotions look like, presumably you'd be able to do even better. Okay, so given that, we wanted to try some other things, and I guess the next, so here's some of the things that you can look at. Automobile sales, home sales, retail sales, travel patterns, etc. Some financial data. We looked at what we call clicks and VIX, where VIX is a volatility measure in the stock market. It turns out the more volatile the stock market, the more people are going to click on financial, or more people are going to query and click on personal financial information. So it's not so much the volume of the market matters, but the volatility, because that's when people start getting anxious. And then also we looked at unemployment-related data. And to motivate that, I want to give you a little picture here. Pull this down. This is actually a little animation from Slate magazine, and you can see the jobs gained in blue and the jobs lost in red. We're in July 2007, August 2007. Up there around Detroit, you're starting to see the recession kick in, unemployment. Now it's over in New York, down in Los Angeles. And you can watch the spread of unemployment during this period in a very, very vivid way. Look at the Midwest, look at California, and then it starts hitting up here in the Bay Area. So it's really a rather remarkable, and then look at Florida down here where the construction, we're so reliant on the construction industry. So you've got what, at this point, as of July 2009, 5.5 million jobs lost. So, pretty scary picture. And let's see. Oops. There it is. Somehow I'm having trouble with getting this. Well, that wasn't a good idea, but let's. Okay, so let's take a look at this unemployment question. We saw that unemployment was a pretty big deal, and the question is, what can we do using the Google data to try to understand these employment statistics better? So it turns out the variable that's of most interest is what's called the initial claims to unemployment benefits. So this is when somebody's laid off, the first thing they do is they go out and file a claim for unemployment benefits. That's called initial claims. And here I plotted the initial claims to unemployment here, and then the unemployment rate in red. So black is initial claims, red is unemployment. And if you look close, and the pink bars are recessions. So if you look closely at this data, you'll see that the initial claims to unemployment peak right before the end of a recession. All right, so in every case that we've seen, the initial claims are the best leading indicator for a recession end, which is why economists watch that number very, very carefully. And you'll see the unemployment rate, which is the red line here, tends to peak about 12 to 18 months after the end of the recession. So once you see the initial claims peaking, that's a really good sign that the things have turned around, although they tend to turn around very slowly in many of these cases, including the current recession. And you would expect to see unemployment then peak about 12 to 18 months later. So what we want to do is we want to look at this initial claims to unemployment. And by the way, even if you aren't interested in the macroeconomic forecasting, it turns out that initial claims to unemployment and unemployment are very good measures of financial distress. So if you look at default rates on credit cards or consumer loans, those are very closely correlated with unemployment as well. All right, so if you go to Google Search Insights and you look at the category welfare and unemployment, you can see a series which is looking very much like the series we just saw. This is a peak after Christmas when temporary workers are hired over the Christmas season or laid off. And then you see everything sort of trot along here, and then there's this huge surge in welfare and unemployment that occurred starting in late 2007, early 2008. Now, if you go through those categories and ask what kind of queries somebody might be issuing when they're unemployed, well, there are three categories that come out. One is jobs. So these are the queries that people are using when they're looking for jobs: Monster, Job Search, Resume, job search engines, and so on. Here, queries are related to welfare and unemployment, unemployment office, food stamps, Department of Labor, and then there are queries over here that typically employers are issuing when they're looking for workers. So these would be temp worker kind of queries. And this also, by the way, is a good economic indicator, because the first thing that firms do when they are coming out of a recession is they hire temp workers, and then if the economy gains strength, then they'll convert some of those temp jobs to regular jobs. So these are the queries, these are the categories that tend to be job related. And if you just plot the searches on welfare and unemployment related queries here in red against the initial claims, indeed you see a very strong correlation. It's pretty clear that you're seeing the initial claims are closely related to the queries on unemployment-related topics. And it's not too surprising, because what would you do if you were laid off from your job? Well, you'd go search for, how do I file for unemployment benefits? Where's the unemployment office? How much is unemployment? How long does it last? Et cetera, et cetera. So we built a little model where we try to do the best we can of building a little econometric model of what the initial claims to unemployment look like, and it turns out the best model we came up with was actually a very simple model. This turns out to be what's called an AR1 model, autoregressive 1, and then we added in the jobs and the welfare queries that we got from the Google Search Insights, and then we looked at this data over the turning point. So the turning point turned out to be March 2009, and here's a picture of the initial claims to unemployment, where it kept rising, then it started to turn. And here's the model we estimate with and without those Google data. Well, it turns out these are the errors. The red line is the errors in forecasts that you get from the reference model. The blue line are the forecast errors you get when you include the unemployment-related searches, and the mean absolute error goes down by about 16%. So you get a 16% improvement in the accuracy of your forecasts over that period. Now remember, you're only forecasting 1 week ahead, because what happens is on Friday, or I guess by the weekend, by Saturday, you've got the Google data. The government official numbers are released the following Thursday, and so basically you're forecasting what the initial claims to unemployment look like in the current week, to try to match the data that's going to be released, the data on that current week that's going to be released the following week. Okay, so you get a kind of nice comparison. Here's another chart. Yeah, this is looking at a slightly more sophisticated model where we're using the seasonally unadjusted data. So remember this, I mentioned that you see these peaks in the initial claims after every Christmas when the temp workers are laid off. And this is the actual in yellow. This is the base forecast, just building a little model to forecast what the unemployment rate or the initial claims to, for unemployment look like without using any additional data. And this is what happens when you also add in the Google Trends data. So the red line tends to be much closer to the yellow line than the blue line is. So this is showing that you really can improve your forecasts quite a bit by adding in that extra variable. And in this case, I used a specific query, namely file for unemployment. So you're looking precisely at the kind of thing that somebody would type in if they were actually concerned about trying to find out how to file for unemployment benefits. And you can do a lot of variations on this. So let me do one last model here. That's about travel destinations. So when you're thinking about taking a vacation or going somewhere, what do? You go to Google and you type in travel to New York or hotels in Washington or whatever the question is that you're going. And in this case, we were able to find this nice data that the Hong Kong Tourism Board released on travel to Hong Kong. And then we could also go look at the Google Trend travel by category, and it turns out one of the destinations that they tracked was travel to Hong Kong. So the question is, how do the queries to Hong Kong help predict the actual arrivals, the actual travel to Hong Kong. So here's a picture where we just overlaid the data for the US, Canada, Great Britain, and so on, because you can look at these queries by the geography where they emanate. You can see pretty clearly there's a similar cyclical behavior in those two series. And again, we're going to apply a little magic of econometrics, where we look at the arrivals to Hong Kong as a function of the Google search data in the previous 3 weeks. We also actually threw in the foreign exchange rate. And if you do that, you end up with really a very, very good prediction. This is a R-squared of over 0.98, where you can look at the arrivals from US, Canada, Great Britain, and so on. Gives you a very good prediction of what the visitors to Hong Kong look like. And we've done some similar things, looking, for example, at the impact of the Florida oil spill, where you saw people who were taking vacations, contemplating taking vacations to Florida on the West Coast. You could see the queries change as they saw these terrible pictures of the oil spill in the Gulf, and many of those vacations shifted to the east coast of Florida. You could actually watch that happen from examining the query traffic. Okay, so those are 3 examples of what you can do. I want to spend the last few minutes talking about some of the interesting challenges that arise in doing this. And one of the big challenges is what economists and statisticians call model selection. So the challenge here is that in economics, we only have relatively few variables. We've got consumption and interest rates and income and all that stuff. But if you think about the queries that go to Google, there are millions of different queries a day that are typed in. So we have this huge amount of data that we're trying to use to predict these particular series of interest in economics. And so there's a challenge of figuring out which queries are the most predictive. So there's work going on at Oxford called Nowcasting, where they've examined a lot of this variable selection issues. I don't want to talk about everything in this slide. I just want to reference the work. And there are at least 25 different methods that you could use to do variable selection in this context. And we decided to try this and see what worked for our particular problems. So I'm going to look now at unemployment. So I'm not looking at initial claims anymore. I'm looking at unemployment, which is the stock of people that are unemployed, and ask what kinds of queries are predictive of unemployment. Well, it turns out we had a little tool where you could feed in the unemployment rate by month, and then the tool would find those queries that were the most highly correlated with unemployment. Okay? So we pulled out 1,000 queries that were most highly correlated with unemployment, and we took a look to see what they looked like. And in general, they fell into 4 different categories. And the first set of queries that were correlated with the unemployment rate, there were labor market queries. Companies that are hiring, jobs classified, Department of Labor, working in Oregon, all things that make a lot of sense. And so it's not too surprising that these would be correlated with the unemployment rate. And then the next set of categories were things about, well, you think about it, here's somebody sitting at home in front of their computer. Remember, at this time, the unemployment rate among young men was 20%, so they were also typing in a lot of queries about free apps and cell phones and good iPod apps, ringtones, all that kind of stuff, technology queries. Those are very highly correlated with unemployment. But then as time goes on, and they still don't get a job, well, then they start typing in things like Atlanta sports cards, guitar scales for beginners, poker hand orders. I mean, that's a pretty good, home workout routines. So you see, you think about it, unemployment is a situation where there's kind of forced leisure, and so they're looking for ways to fill in the forced leisure. And maybe you can guess what the next category is. It turns out it's looking for porn tube, jailbait teen, and all sorts of things like that. And I will say, it's not that this category was really shorter than the others. I just had to censor it much more than the others. And indeed, if you go look at this, so up here's the entertainment-related queries, plotted against the unemployment rate, the adult queries plotted against the unemployment rate, the labor queries plotted against the unemployment rate, you can see that actually the entertainment and adult queries are just as highly correlated as the labor market related queries. Because really, as I said, being unemployed is like having too much leisure. You know, they say the idle mind is the devil's playground, and so people are looking for all sorts of things that they can do to fill in that time. So the question is, are these predictive? Are they predictive? And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but what we did is we tried some statistical techniques where we picked the top most correlated queries, which included a lot of those entertainment and technology queries and so on, and tried to use some of these variable selection mechanisms. And over here, we used our judgment as economists and said, well, let's focus in on those labor market related queries. Okay? Well, it turns out that you do far, far, far better by picking the labor market related queries than just starting with the most highly correlated stuff. So in fact, the correlation, the best you could do picking these top 60 correlation was to get a mean absolute error of about 37%, but if you use the labor market related variables, you get a mean absolute error of about 5%, so you do much, much better. And in fact, the same thing happens if you look at initial claims, where the labor market related stuff is a far better predictor than just the highest correlation. So the conclusion that I draw is economists are not out of a job quite yet. It's still important to have some judgment about what the economic causation or economic patterns might be when you're trying to do this kind of variable selection. So, and of course that brings me to one final point about these initial claims. It turns out that there are analysts on Wall Street who are trying to forecast initial claims because they're important as a macroeconomic predictor. And we discovered that every Friday, Bloomberg reports the analyst consensus for initial claims, what it's going to be when it's reported the following week. So we're curious, how well does our model, which you saw was a very, very simple model, how well does it do compared to those financial analysts on Wall Street? And it turns out we do a little bit worse. So what happens is the mean absolute error for the Wall Street forecasters is about 3%, and we do about 3.5%. So we do somewhat worse. On the other hand, if you have 30 Wall Street analysts, what do you suppose that is? Probably $15 million a year for 30 Wall Street analysts, maybe at a minimum. And our data is, of course, completely free and available to everybody. So maybe it's not quite as accurate, but at least it's very cost effective. And indeed, when you think about it, the Wall Street analysts know that, well, this month the government hired a lot of census workers, and this month they laid off a lot of census workers, and this month the auto companies decided to stay open an extra month. So they're using all of that current event processed by human information processing, so maybe it's not too surprising they can beat one of these statistical models. But I think what is interesting is the statistical model can still do quite a good job. So maybe that's a good place to end, on a note of optimism, that you can do some prediction of the present using some fairly simple methods. And I'd like to open the floor for questions. So, thank you. And we do have a couple of mics, so when you raise your hand, they'll try to get you a mic.
So the weekly numbers are being revised constantly.
Yes.
How do you do versus the revisions? Perhaps you do even better than
Right,
the
so the series we use for the historical series is we're using the revised data, and then when we forecast in March 2009, we were actually doing that sometime in the fall of 2010, so we were using the revised numbers. But I think your point is extremely important. Just because we happen to be off this week doesn't mean we're really off. We should wait until the revised numbers come in and then see how well we're doing there. So we would like to explore that. It turns out you have to dig in a little bit to find the pre-revision numbers. So we're working on that. Good question. There was another question over here. No? Oh, here's a, all right, look at.
All right. So this is actually a little bit about predicting the future, right? So you talked about, I think we can understand in the last 10 years, Google Trends has been one of the most large-scale, reliable sources for data that you can use to predict the present. But what do you think about this going into the future? Do you expect Google to deliver, remain at the top on that? Or do you feel that the ability to predict the present, that there is a threat from maybe more modern tools, Facebook, Twitter, activity happening there that is more predictive of real
Right.
time?
So I think that there's a huge opportunity for all kinds of real-time data, because what is amazing now is virtually every major company has a data system which will produce real-time information. You look at the big retailers, they've all got cash registers that are tied into the central computer, and on a day-by-day, and in some cases an hour-by-hour basis, what retail sales are looking like. And you can look at this pretty much across the board. You look at the transportation industry, how many passengers flew from A to B on with maybe a day lag at most. So all of that real-time data could be integrated with the traditional government data, which is reported on a monthly or quarterly basis, and we believe can result in much, much better economic predictions. So it's not just the Google data, that's what we've been using, but there's lots of other data out there that can be used for doing this kind of thing. There's a question here.
So this is a question.
Wait, 1 second. Okay.
This is a question related to difficult to spell queries. So then, of course, Google suggests if you misspell something, did you mean this?
Right.
So if one were to then click through the yes, I did mean this, then does that count as a data point for the correct spelling?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that system, the Google spelling correction system, is not based in a dictionary. It's based on actual spelling errors that people make, which is why it applies to proper names and everything else. So it's a nice example of how you can utilize that data to fix all kinds of spelling problems. It's definitely a learning system.
And I've actually got a quick question about automobile sales.
Yep.
Your model for predicting Toyota sales ended right at the start of 2010.
Yes.
Was the recalls, did that really mess with Google's ability to predict sales? Because I'm guessing there's a lot of noise of just people trying to get information about the recalls.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because there are a lot of people typing in Toyota-related queries, but they were looking for information on the recalls, not necessarily looking to buy. So you do want to try to control for that kind of effect. And indeed, you may have heard, some of you may have heard of Google flu trends, where we're looking at incidences of flu and actually also other kinds of diseases. And what happens is when people are typing in symptoms, those are pretty good predictors of what flu or flu-like diseases look like. But the trouble is, as soon as there's a story on the evening news or in the newspaper, then all the hypochondriacs start typing in the symptoms, and then the model tends to have some problems. So, oil spill is a very, very big query in 2010 for obvious reasons. And then you could see how it kind of, first it was just a few people who knew about it, and then it takes off as it got more and more media attention. So you do have to be careful about some of this data in terms of interpreting it correctly.
Have you looked into selection bias for people using Google versus other search engines, or people not looking for a search engine on the web? And can you use sort of a hypothesis about that kind of behavior to improve your prediction ability?
Well, what happened is my colleagues at Yahoo Research have also used the Yahoo data for doing similar things, and they've been doing things like predicting the opening gross of movies and predicting CD sales, that kind of stuff. So you can look at entertainment-related events as well. And they also find pretty much the conclusion that I reached that the best alternative methods that require a lot of human intervention can gather all sorts of additional data and can get reasonable predictions for these things. But using the search data is very, very convenient, very inexpensive, and very easy, and performs about as well as those human-intensive methods. So their paper, you could find it, I think, just by Googling it or even Yahooing it, for that matter. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Take the chair's prerogative here and ask a question. I'm just curious if you could spell out what you think the the economic intuition is for the use of these data. Kind of follow-up question is, is it better to have information that's 2 days old, 3 days old, or 1 day old, and how do people's actions change depending on the age of that information? It seems that there's a strong incentive to find out what's going on right now, but I'd like to hear why you guys think this is important.
Well, I think it's important because, first of all, it's definitely important for many businesses. So I'll give you a simple example. These places in Florida were very concerned about how many people would be visiting them, and to the extent that the searches on those vacation destinations were correlated with future visitors, they were quite interested in that information. And the automotive companies are quite interested in these issues about how many cars are going to be selling this month or next month and so on. So lots and lots of businesses and other organizations are interested in getting a peek into the future, even if it's only a few weeks. But I think from the government point of view, what tends to happen, if you think about this data on unemployment, everybody is very anxiously watching the unemployment rate and the initial claims. You didn't see it in these charts, but what happened since March 2009, initial claims went way down and then leveled out. So for pretty much all of 2010, the initial claims for unemployment have been more or less flat. And then in the last couple weeks, it looks like they've turned down again, although today they went up a bit. So that's a very, very closely watched statistic because it gives us some idea of what the unemployment rate is going to look like, gives us some idea of how quickly we're going to emerge from the recession. So it's always useful to know what the future is like, even if we can only get it a little bit ahead. Yep, more questions over here.
Hi.
Okay.
Yes, first.
Gotcha.
I've actually used the Google Trends in some of my work, but your data only goes so far.
True.
I think it goes to 2004 or so. Yet Google does a lot of archival service with books and news and so on. And I was wondering, one thing that we did in our work was actually, for instance, look at the instances of the word recession in the news. So you go to the archives of the New York Times, you can go pretty far back, and then look at the incidence of stories with that word. Is there any tool that Google has that would permit someone to do searches on archival material?
Well, we have the Google Books, Google Library program, and so that, of course, is digitized 10 million books from University of California, University of Michigan, several other major universities, and so you can definitely do all sorts of scholarly searches through that the corpus of
But
books.
it doesn't tabulate the number of times the word recession happens.
No. What happens is actually part of the agreement, if the agreement is approved, there is a special interface for scholarly work. So you can do all sorts of things that you can't do with the public interface. So we'll see what happens on that front. But I think it is very important to be able to search those archives, and you would in general want to do things at a, I should say, you'd like to do things that would be much more flexible using the interface for scholars than you might using just the public interface. So it should have that capability.
I'm an economic, sorry, someone
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
I'm an economic historian who studies societies far in the past, and it's very hard to get insight into most of the things that people are doing. But it occurs to me with Google's data, eventually, I mean, all of these queries are coming from an IP address, and there's all these interconnections between these queries that Google wouldn't want to say anything about now. But the interesting question is Google going to store that so that 80 years from now, we'll actually have this complete kind of picture of how people's concerns interrelated and how income level was related to various questions that people were asking?
Absolutely. I mean, we're storing that data, and 80 years from now, you'll be able to put it on your cell phone and just pull it up from there. If you look at the amount of space that it takes to store this data, it's a huge amount of data. But of course, storage technology is improving so rapidly that the cost of storing a given amount of data keeps going down, down, and down. So, in fact, it certainly. Intention is to store the data for forever.
I remember when Ronald Reagan was president, and he had some sort of a cancerous polyp removed, and there was a lot of media attention. And there was an interesting article published on phone calls to the National Cancer Registry, and it was a huge spike, and then it decayed. And I was wondering if you guys have looked at, more one-of-a-kind type, when videos go viral, they say,
Right.
or internet memes or that kind of thing, and studied the characteristics of those more episodic events.
Yes, actually, we have looked at that, and we haven't really reported anything on it, but one of the interesting things to look at are rumors. So, for example, a very common rumor on the internet is X is dead. Right? There will always be some rumors. So-and-so died, and some of them are true, and some of them are false. And one of the questions that you might ask is, well, how soon can you tell which are true and which are false? So we've looked at that. It's not a really easy problem, because even though there are many rumors of this sort, when we go dig through it, we can find maybe 70 or 80 instances. If we had 600 or 700, then I think we'd really be able to make some progress. But right now, we've looked into that question, but we don't have any real answers at this point. It's a good question, though, I think.
I'm interested in your office at Google. You're chief economist.
Yes.
And I'd like to know the size of your staff and what are your responsibilities, if any?
Well, you put me on the spot here. So what happened is when I stepped down as dean, I got time off for good behavior. So I had a year free, and Eric Schmidt invited me to come down to Google when there were 400 people there and work on some problems that they were dealing with. And one of the things I worked on at the very beginning was looking at the ad auction, because Google makes all of its revenue by selling ads, and all of those ads are auctioned. There's a very specific and interesting auction that Google uses. So I tried to model the behavior of that auction using game theoretic techniques, and then using some econometric techniques to measure it to see how well the theory worked. So that was a lot of fun and quite interesting. And there's been a number of other academic papers on that topic in the last 8 years. So after that, I started working on forecasting, kind of things that we're talking about here. We are trying to forecast what revenue growth looks like, what query growth looks like, where you're going to need new data centers, that kind of stuff. And my team still does various kinds of forecasting. And the way I describe my job is I'd like to answer the questions that management is going to ask next month. So a lot of the stuff we're working on is stuff where we think there's going to be a business issue or maybe a policy issue in some cases that arises, and we try to bring data to bear on that problem, because Google is a very, very data-driven company, as you might imagine. And when your 3 top executive officers all have PhDs in computer science, you can imagine they want to see a lot of quantitative analysis go into those decisions. So my group, I have about 10 people that are direct reports. I work very closely with a group called Quantitative Marketing that has about 35 people. They do a lot of marketing analytics. We've got roughly 150 statisticians at Google. So when I say statistician, I mean somebody who has a degree in statistics or econometrics or operations research, sometimes physics, mathematics, basically who are doing quantitative analysis. And pretty much every team at Google, where they're producing a product, there's a quantitative analyst in that group that's responsible for measuring what's going on with that product, how many adopters, how much uses are, how changes are impacted, or running experiments with different variations on the user interface to see what the reaction would be, so on and so on and so on. So last year, in fact, Google ran, just on the search algorithm, there were 6,000 experiments that were run examining variations on the search algorithm. And on the ad side, roughly it's about the same number, sort of same order of magnitude, 5,000 or 6,000. And these experiments are very carefully designed treatment control experiments where you can look at the impact of a particular change. So the system is evolving. It's evolving because all the way along, you're trying different things, see what works. If it works, you bake it into place, and then you go try the next thing. So it's a situation where in order to support that kind of evolution, that continuous improvement model, you really have to have a pretty good group of quantitative analysts. Yes. Oh, wait, I have to get the mic. We have to get the mic there.
Do censorship issues, for instance, in a place like China, affect the way that you collect data for Google Trends?
So countries have different attitudes about things that are sensitive in that particular country. For example, in Germany, you can't advertise Nazi memorabilia. That's illegal. And so you can't accept ads for that kind of stuff, even though that's perfectly legal in the US, and there are people who collect this material. And in other countries, there might be sensitivities about the royal family or the political leaders of that country. And so every country where Google has a presence, we, of course, obey the local laws with respect to that kind of material. And that means you do have to censor things that's viewed by people in that country. That's just a fact of doing business. Now, in most cases, these are not really huge problems because it's a relatively limited area, and we've learned to live with that.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Well, he's just got it here, so. Yes?
Hey, I was just wondering, the new Google Instant, I was wondering if there's been any problems with kind of relationships between different, like the searches that you had. Someone might be searching for something like, where's the unemployment line, and then they see something about entertainment come up in the Google Instant thing, and how those things kind of correlate with each other, and if that poses a problem for your data.
Well, we've watched this pretty closely. So Google Instant, for those of you who don't know about it, is where you start typing in a query and the results will change as you type. And it's a kind of improvement or variation on Google Suggest, which is suggesting different completions for your query. And there was a lot of concern, would this lead to shorter queries, longer queries, more focused queries, less focused queries, all sorts of things. From what we can tell, it hasn't had a really huge impact in any of those areas. I mean, people like it. It really helps people get to the result they want more quickly, so you don't have to search and look and refine your query. You can do it in a more efficient manner, but it doesn't seem to have a huge impact on the kinds of queries.
How good are the data of Google to predict major political events, being election of an outcome, or let's say I'm in Iran and something is going to happen, the revolution is brewing. Can I use that to predict these events?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, of course, we don't have so many examples of historical incidents where you're trying to predict some political event. We have looked at elections. So for example, Scott Brown in Massachusetts, you could see queries on Scott Brown from Massachusetts were rocket up. So it was quite clear he was getting a lot of attention. And we saw when we looked at the UK elections, the Liberal candidate, Clegg, who is relatively unknown, saw a lot of searches on his name after the first debates that they had for the UK election. So what tends to happen is you may have a candidate who's relatively unknown. Well, people are going to do Google searches for that candidate if they are interested in what he or she has to say. So it's definitely of interest there to understand what awareness, how awareness grows for political candidates. And I suspect there are many other applications. We just haven't looked at them, but I'd encourage people to try that kind of thing.
So Android is a hot topic right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how Google Trends has influenced product development or strategy in the mobile space?
So it's a good question. I mean, you can look at apps and you can see people searching for Angry Birds. You know, when Angry Birds came out for the Android, there was a big surge of interest, and you can definitely see that in the data. But I haven't seen anything that was really sort of econometric or statistics. Most of it has been anecdotal. So when there's, let's say, a leak or a announcement about a new operating system for Android coming out, there will be a surge of queries on that particular name. And we've definitely seen that happen, but it's not really predictive. It's just showing you how interested people are in that particular topic. There's probably some good applications there. We just haven't thought of any. I mean, we haven't dug into it deep enough to come up with some. Two more questions. One back there, I guess. Where's the other mic? Here's somebody up here has a question.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there, can you name like one or two topics that you're particularly interested in over the next several months that you, in your interest to get clean samples, that you're actually affecting the search outcomes, you know, to try to get the sample really clean because you've found muddled results in the past or something like that?
I guess I don't quite understand the question.
Okay. Like the way that you set up search results or that you can influence search results or have something come out on top or whatever, because that you might have an interest in doing that because you're getting muddled sample results.
Well, it's not, I mean, it's not so much, I mean, sample, not so much for this kind of work, but if it's something where you, I mean, all of our search results are algorithmically driven, and so what happens is we're constantly refining the algorithm to give improved results. And the way you decide whether the results are improved is you have human subjects and you have lots of indicators that people are interested in a particular topic. So if you see, here's the algorithm producing this list of search results, and everybody seems to be clicking on result number 3, well, maybe result number 3 should be up there in position 1. So you're using that kind of audience response to try to improve the system, and we have lots of indicators for when we're doing a good job. And so the algorithm is constantly evolving with respect to those indicators, and that's kind of how it works. Last question here.
You mentioned a tool that you can use to basically upload or import a series, and then the Google Trends would find a set of similar series.
Right. So
Is
that I have
available?
to say that particular tool is internal use only. That's not. It's not been. And I'll tell you, it's one of these things. It's not because it wouldn't be good to have it available to lots of people, but it is quite expensive computationally. So to do these computations to find out the highest correlations involves some effort.
And I didn't have this question until just now, but might you sell that as a service or some other services based on, now that you're collecting all this data? Do you have a plan for that?
There's been discussion of that, and we've been asked this question many times because people say, well, I want to look at this data and you've given me this interface, but can I have API so we can just pull it down by the computer, we don't have to go to it every day? Or can I have data that's done at a finer level of geography or over more time, all this kind of stuff? Well, right now this product, the Google Search Insights, is a free product. We're providing it as a service to our advertisers and users, and it doesn't have a real business model wrapped around it at this point. But obviously, we're thinking about whether there would be ways that you could provide additional services to people, but no decisions have been made on that front. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and it's been a pleasure to be here.